just a pleasure to be able to speak with you all today. Over my career, I've been a practitioner in community development without having realized that it was called community development. And Rutgers gave me the opportunity to explore this academically, first with a master's in public administration, and then with their MS PhD program in community development through Rutgers Camden, a small program of mighty professors and just really great students, and learned a ton there. And now I'm back home in Puerto Rico and still a PhD student, but looking forward to being that candidate very soon. And so what I've been doing, as well as a practitioner, is I've realized that I'm a bit of an activist as well as a scholar. So I'm in this sort of area where I'm activist, scholar, practitioner, and it's an interesting place to be. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of objectivity and subjectivity, but I could just say that I think all of the academic work that we do as academics is rooted in a fair amount of subjectivity, although as scientists and social scientists, that is hotly debated in some circles. So I won't say any more. I've got a presentation here today. This is like hot off the press. Hold on a second. Let me turn off my phone. And yeah, it is hot off the press. And when I say that, I haven't presented this to really anybody, although some of you may recognize part of it. Are you seeing the whole screen, or are you seeing just this slide?
No, we're seeing like, yeah, the whole screen with the next one up.
Okay, let me do this again then. I chose the wrong one. That's it, right?
Perfect.
Okay. And so what I'll talk about is a little bit about the academic constructs that are kind of underpinning where I think my dissertation might end up going. And I'm still forming my dissertation committee, so this is very, wet behind the ears. And I'm very excited to hear from the scholars that are here, and also from the community practitioners that are here, any thoughts about what I'll be presenting, because all of your input is very important to me. So I am talking about critical climate adaptation. So, and hegemonic, for people who don't know what it means, hegemonic is like the dominant way of doing things. It's the way that sometimes it's so embedded in what we do and live that we don't even question it. But going against the hegemony or countering the hegemony can be very positive in terms of creating a more level playing space and redefining equity and equitable outcomes for people. And so my community of practice is actually Barrio Playa. It is the largest south coastal barrio in Puerto Rico. And I live in one of the communities. It's a population of about 11,000 people. And I've been blessed to bring my skills and my resources and my interests and passion at the invitation of a community-rooted organization that is now a nonprofit called Un Nuevo Amanecer. And many of my colleagues here on the line are also collaborators with Un Nuevo Amanecer. So just to give a bit of background, in terms of this. So there's people worldwide who are living without land security. And according to the most recent data that I get my hands on, about 500,000 of these people live in Puerto Rico's informal settlements. Were designated as things called special communities. Elsewhere, you might hear them called slums. But in South America and in the Caribbean, they've been designated as special communities, which tends to have a different kind of stigma to it. That those communities that are special communities that are living in low-lying coastal areas, in particular in the climate in the Caribbean and small island developing nations, are very much in particular at risk of climate change. And that, interestingly enough, there's a kind of a dual dynamic that we see here in Puerto Rico. And Dr. Fuller can definitely, speak to this as well. But we're seeing sort of in Puerto Rico, sort of the international mode of planning for upgrades to special communities and slums, as well as the North American style, which is poverty elimination strategies, which is, move in a bulldozer and move out the poor people. And so the FEMA and the HUD programs, which are quote unquote voluntary acquisition programs, are effectively displacing poor communities and eroding community social and psychological health in the process. This is the people who are studying this, a few of them cited there. And so some might argue that state-funded climate mitigation programs like the Hazardous Mitigation Grant Program and the HUD acquisition program displace communities and enact the same kind of social harms that were done on Black and brown people in the US during the days of poverty deconcentration programs. The gaps that I want to address in this research are as follows. Obviously, you have to address the elephant in the room, which is that reducing the real risks from flooding is clearly a desirable outcome of buyout programs. You can't deny that, but it has some downsides. And there's a dearth of practical applied case learning. So practically research for examples and particular settings that can explore alternatives to this sort of hegemonic, dominant displacement strategy that the US has, and how the communities organize and produce neighborhood transformations is really poorly understood, especially in context outside of the mainland United States. So this research and the case in Playa de Ponce could help fill that gap. And then we can also look at how new institutional approaches to climate adaptation and power relations can be illustrated through cases. So for those who don't know, there's a little orange speck here on the bottom of the screen. I don't know if my mouse will work, but there it is. That is Barrio Playa. It is about 20 communities representing multiple cases potentially, and has a history actually of displacement that dates back at least to the 30s. And I just realized I didn't put this really groovy slide that I've got that traces the landmass from the air in 1930 and demonstrates where communities have been eliminated in the last 90 years. But interestingly enough, there is an amazing amount of staying power in Playa de Ponce as well. So let's just talk about some of the background here. There's some real governance and policy concerns, and these are continually and active, and not just in this case in Playa. And some of these things my colleagues from Anthropocene Alliance and other practitioners are going to recognize. So current and forecasted flood risk information communities is often missing or incorrect. It's a huge gap for communities being able to plan. FEMA flood maps are outdated and are being used to deny recovery investment in communities. Puerto Rico's housing department, Vivienda, is executing displacement strategies with potential for morally problematic land speculation and future use of HUD CDBG disaster recovery funds. And in particular, I refer to the policy guide that guides the private sector implementation of these acquisition programs that states essentially there's no conservation requirement of the acquired lands, although the intention is to do so. And that's very problematic because it means people will be displaced from their homes, and potentially those properties can be sold to a highest bidder, and something else can be put in its place, which is sort of a real estate grab if you just want to put it in plain black and white language. Ponce's hazardous mitigation program also furthers displacement with the approval of a levy in that plan for Rio Portugues, cutting through a special community. And I would hazard a guess that nobody in that community knows that Rio Portugues levy is in the hazardous mitigation plan that's been approved for Ponce. Ponce's got some real problems with its MS4, which is the stormwater management authorized authorities by the US EPA. And actually, we have a meeting in 2 weeks with the EPA to hear out some community concerns. We know that some sectors flood with sewage water, and this is actually a problem across the barrio, including my neighborhood as well. There are an expired Department of Natural Resources permitting agreement, which previously allowed the city, the municipality of Ponce to permit projects in the maritime zone. That's expired. And so we're actually seeing in this gap and this lack of enforcement that is endemic to DNR throughout, the news media, we're seeing that that there are projects and demolitions taking place in wetlands, which I think are very problematic. And we know that when you begin to fill wetlands, you create flooding issues elsewhere. Also underfunded or no funding to maintain US Army Corps of Engineers levee. In our situation, it creates a $700 million moral hazard because people are moving into an area where they think is safe. And if there's no funds to maintain the levees, how safe is it? The background risks here is that the barrio has riverine flooding, it experiences sea level rise, it has coastal erosion. We have experienced extreme heat, multiple days of extreme heat this last summer. It's seismic active. We're seeing some land subsidence, and there's also a tsunami zone here. That the public infrastructure is a structured disinvestment in the otherwise protective infrastructure. It's obsolete, it's poorly maintained. Stormwater and sewage infrastructure is not working in this neighborhood in the way that it should be designed. And then our mayor, who is represented here by Osiris, this is a hard critique to hear perhaps, because we know the pumps actually work, they switch on, but they don't move the water. And that's a real issue because people are flooding for decades. The natural infrastructure has been degraded due to industrialization in the port and fill and build strategies. There's tenurelessness in those special communities. People don't own the homes they don't own the land on which their homes sit in some cases. And there's a formality that is developed, across the neighborhood. It has positive aspects in terms of, accessing human capital and social capital for building out your home or adapting your home. But it also is occurring in places where there's high levels of social vulnerability, and we're seeing moderate place abandonment. The barrio itself is about 11,000 people, has 3 exits from the entire barrio. So if there was an emergency, it's very doubtful that all the people would get out. And that we've seen a 19% population loss in the last decade for multiple reasons. In the absence of a comprehensive plan to address flooding, the literature demonstrates very clearly in small island developing states in the Caribbean that people will take strategies in their own hand. And that's no different for us here in Barrio Playa. On the top right, we see a house that's on cinder blocks. It's great for keeping the house cool, but in a seismically active zone, putting a house on cinder blocks may not be a safe strategy. And in the top left, we see that the people raised their home, built their home up on cement, covered their whole entire yard in cement and a higher ground, and that would then push floodwaters onto their neighbors. And then in an extreme case, the gradation of the land in one set of properties in Barrio Playa has been raised to the extent where it would also push floodwaters to neighbors. So these are individualized adaptation strategies that protect the individual, but don't protect the community and actually may make matters worse for communities. So I mentioned a 19% outmigration from our barrio. This is not what the entire barrio looks like, but it could be typical of some sectors of the barrio, which is illustrative of space abandonment and unused space. And then our colleague from the River Network, Diana, brought us some funding, and the community has done a inventory of abandoned sites with the assistance of our colleagues at the Center for Reconstruction of Habitat and Luis Gallardo's amazing group. This is a map that I produced. The red dots represent public nuisance sites that were surveyed by our community members in 2022. The special communities are outlined in the bit thicker red lines here. So we've got 2 of them here, and then 2 of them over here. And then we've got flooding mapped here. The bluish flooding areas, like these heat zones, are interviews that took place prior to Fiona, where we asked people, does it flood here? If so, how deeply? And you can see the indication, the deeper the blue, the deeper the flooding. And then also the storm surge projections from Maria demonstrate that the storm surge actually deeply affects the special communities in the sector, the oldest part of Playa de Ponce, which is an historic port city. And then here's some rather shocking photos from the flooding that occurred in Hurricane Fiona, the really catastrophic flooding that occurred across the barrio. We knew that these areas would flood. We've never seen it flood like this. And sorry for the disaster porn, but I think it really drives home a point that, yeah, we've got a real problem here. Also, we've got deteriorated infrastructure. This is the levee that was built by the U.S. Corps of Army Engineers. It's supposed to be maintained by the Department of Natural Resources, kind of east waterways. This actually protects a golf course and million-dollar homes just across the river from us. And you can see that the result of Fiona exposed the pilings, the riffraff is gone, and really the structure is very much deteriorated, which is a real concern. So let's think about how problematizing sort of the status quo. First of all, our society's ideas of justice and fairness and efficiency are guided by utilitarianism, or really, 19th century and 18th century British and Scottish thinkers. The concept here of utilitarianism is that the government has the objective capacity to distill what are the best interests of the majority of the people, and then make decisions based on that. Well, obviously, there's always going to be winners and there's always going to be losers. And so the government then imposes these preferences in the name of public, common public interest. And this is where we begin to see inequities being produced. So the takeaway here is that produces systematic inequities. And as long as the aggregate benefits outweigh the aggregate costs, then these kind of decisions are justified. And in terms of where investment goes to protect infrastructure, housing, the cost-benefit analysis takes place again. And if the houses are undervalued, these we can see from the literature tend not to receive the protective infrastructure and tend instead to receive the buyouts. Also, the current status quo fails to address really problems with power relations. And there's a series of scholars who've talked about power relations. They're things that are socially produced and reproduced, according to Foucault. Power, in his viewpoint, is nowhere and yet everywhere. And then Lukes would state that power is about who decides and what is decided. And it's exercised over some groups against their interests. And then Howe would suggest that there's a false consciousness, that the legitimized elite interests are embodied through the state, through elections, through laws, through regulations, and that the elite themselves don't necessarily connect the dots to how these decisions are affecting the individual. And this plays out also in racialized capital, where we see, Black and brown bodies their identities being extracted to make other people wealthy. Also, the status quo pushing resilient strategies. Resilience is a really big deal these days. Our community actually is a beneficiary of Whole Community Resilience Planning Project. But in the hazardous literature, the ideas of resilience are really, it sounds good, reduce risk and vulnerability in order to diminish the effects of outside shocks. And so it's a strategy for adaptation that can shorten recovery time and anticipated future vulnerability and risks. Yet the concept of resilience is actually pretty ill-defined because it runs from psychology all the way to, ecology. And in that, it allows government, it allows politicians, it allows practitioners, because it's not a concept that's deeply questioned, to say, oh, well, it's resilient. That means it's good. That means people are going to be able to bounce back. And the problem with these resilience planning programs is, among other things, that the resilience strategies don't address fundamental inequities that have created the vulnerabilities in the first place. That now we're seeing that resilience strategies are being embraced by communities or embraced by politicians. The communities can resolve their own problems. But this in and of itself is also problematic, as Professor Danley at Rutgers in his book noted, that these neighborhood movements can actually be a politics of last resort because nothing else has worked. Where local, state, and federal authorities have failed us, now it's the neighborhood to get it done. And unfortunately, many of these neighborhood organizations are low capacity, are under-resourced, are volunteers, tire out, burnout. And Danley's book about post-Katrina illustrated this very deeply. Then there's the status quo of planning regimes that further embed the status quo often. I love this little graphic on the right. It's in French. Je participe, tu participes. It's basically saying, I participate, you participate, he participates, we participate, you participate, they profit. And it's a critique from Arnsten and her seminal work about the ladder of participation from tokenism all the way up to community control. And citizen participation has been a strategy in which the have-nots get to come to the table and get to share in the setting of goals, and that's like an ideal. But frequently, these socially marginalized groups that come to the table are asked to put aside their longstanding grievances in the search for consensus. And so the status quo, the inequities continue to be embedded. And then planners are legitimized also because they are supporting sort of this utilitarian ideal of maximizing the public interest, whether it's economic or spatial manifestation, planning streets, etc. So the frameworks that I'm interested in exploring with the research are collective action. So how do communities come together and mobilize, as well as the ideas and concepts about social capital and community capital, moral hazards, and this critical theory of society, which a German philosopher Marcuse has spoken about or written about, and he talks about the utopian spirit, founding decisions about the transformation of our societies based on a moral guide, not a utilitarian guide. And the research question I'm really interested in exploring are the following. What are the determinants that allow informal communities to stay put amid sort of these large forces that would displace them, especially due to climate change? And what role, if any, does insurgent planning play? to improve equity for those who stay or those who leave? And how do displaced residents fare socially and economically after they've been displaced? And in particular, we'll have the opportunity to have cases from Playa because of the historic displacements that occurred here in the neighborhood. And I've already been able to resource some of these people, for interviews. I'm excited about that. And then how might adapting in place actually produce moral hazards, which is giving people the illusion that they're safe, even though they've adapted in place, but in fact, they may continue to be, deeply in objective danger. And so the contribution that I hope to make in my research is to delve into these ideas of collective action dilemmas, and also to provide evidence that insurgent planning and community organizing can transform living conditions that are sort of counter-hegemonic. And I'd like to use participatory action research as my method. Participatory action research is where the researcher comes in, works with the community members to develop a set of research strategies and topics that actually serve the interests of the communities. So it's kind of the opposite of a researcher coming in, helicoptering in, extracting information and leaving. In this case, actually the researcher is embedding themselves within the community and responding to the community's needs and desires by helping them produce research that can help them further their actual goals. Related to that, I know some of you are interested in this. Let's see if it'll work here. Skip verification. Are you guys seeing a spreadsheet?
No.
Let me share the spreadsheet. So this is the table of secured funding and in-kind contributions and pending decisions from Un Nuevo Amanecer. I updated this in June, I guess, July, updated in July. And so if we look at the bottom line here, because of our partnerships and because of the work we've been doing, Un Nuevo Amanecer has been able to secure between in-kind and grants, $625,000 for planning, which is really exciting. And we've got a NIFWIF, National Coastal Resilience Fund grant proposal. The little birdie told me ours was highly rated. We'll hear about that in the next couple of weeks, I think, if we won it, which is also really exciting because it means that we may be able to do some planning around coastal restoration, protecting, the coast. But here we've got a whole list of different organizations from the American Association of Planners, Kresge Foundation, Mosaic Foundation, the Anthropocene Alliance has contributed in kind and as well as in cash. Patagonia Foundation through the River Network, a colleague here online, Thriving Earth Exchange, providing scientists. This project is still in development. The Corps of Army Engineers is supposed to be beginning, I've heard 2023, early 2023 now, a study, floodplain management study, which would produce at the end of it multiple types of solutions from green infrastructure to gray infrastructure that could be protective for a community. The communities won a whole communities resilience planning grant, which is just initiating now. And I'm hoping to be able to lead that. We've got some EPA, Brownfields regionally directed technical assistance to reconceptualize the abandonment in the community and look at the possibility of creating community goods and services from these sites instead of having real estate speculation that further displaces people. I mentioned the National Coastal Resilience Fund grant proposal, which we're waiting on. And then Climate Migration Network and Buy-in Community Planning has been working with the community leaders to design a series of interview questions as well as a survey instrument, an exploratory survey instrument to go into the community and understand what are people's perceptions of flooding and what do they want to do about it? So this is all really exciting. This is ongoing, and hopefully will be ongoing for a while, and may present a real opportunity for doing additional work. This is a Nuevo Amanecer, part of the team. Pastor Roberto, who approached me back in 2016, Ramon Figueroa, they're the founders of the organization, and it's a domestic nonprofit, just obtained its 501c3 status, all volunteer community organization, represents and collaborates with leaders across 20 barrios, 20 communities in the barrio. I'm assisting them, I guess, as an advisor, and it's the only institution in the barrio that is working on climate resilience and adaptation. And I think a key takeaways from some of the work that I've been doing with them is that our North American partners have been incredible in their ability to embrace the cultural distinctions and nuances that are distinctly Puerto Rican and really quite different from the North American mode of doing things. And they've been really open to working with us. They've even dedicated translation and interpretation resources. So there's not a language barrier, and it's just been phenomenal. And I think it's also really important to just put it out there that climate adaptation does occur at the local level. And as Danley pointed out, it is a politics of last resort in some cases, because these organizations like UNA are tremendously under-resourced. They're volunteer organizations. And to be able to address the historic inequalities that these buyouts can perpetuate, they really need to receive the resources that can allow them to do that. So I'd like to open it up for discussion if there's time. And just with these 4 questions, what about this work? Yes.
We're still seeing your spreadsheet, your Excel spreadsheet. I'm not sure you're meaning to share that.
There we go.
Thank you.
So let me go back then. That's the Nuevo Amanecer, folks. The photo. Can you see that now, Diana?
Yeah.
Okay. And some of the work that they're doing in the community, beach cleanups, et it's really a great group of folks, and I feel very honored to be a collaborator with them. And so for discussion, I'm open to any critique, feedback, thoughts, but also I'm curious to know about what about this work might make you hopeful, where you see alignment in organizations or other initiatives that you may have heard of, because we're always looking for people and resources and ideas that we should be made aware of. And what connections and key messages do you think we should share out of this work?